Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
It is really great to be jumping into this one today.
Yeah, I am so excited for this deep dive because, okay, I want you just to imagine this scenario for a second. You and your absolute best friend are locked in a maximum security prison for life.
Just a really light, easy start.
Right, exactly. But, you have zero hope of escape, no chance of parole. So you make this solemn, beautiful vow to each other.
You renounce the outside world.
Yes, you promise to be perfectly, undeniably loyal to each other. You literally declare that this friendship is the only thing that matters in the entire universe.
It's very noble.
It is. But then literally 5 minutes later, you look out the barred window, you see a girl picking flowers, and immediately, without any hesitation, you start trying to murder your best friend.
It is just such a wildly intense pivot.
It's insane. But welcome to the psychologically shattered world of the Two Noble Kinsmen.
Yeah, it's a text that just completely destroys any illusion we might have. That classical literature is, just neat, tidy moral fables.
Oh, there is nothing tidy about this.
Not at all. The landscape we're exploring today is extraordinarily murky. It's a world where high-minded honor looks terrifyingly similar to unchecked ego.
And where those profound philosophical vows you mentioned just crumble the second they hit actual reality.
Right, which is precisely why we're tearing into it. We want to act as guides here, helping you, the listener, extract some really practical wisdom from all this chaos.
Because these ancient dilemmas, knights fighting for glory, archaic medical cures, they operate on the exact same psychological hardware as the stuff you deal with every day.
The deeply unethical corporate environments or toxic social circles. It's all the same human mechanics.
Absolutely. And to make it even more fascinating, we are also going to look at this play through the lens of a brilliant 19th century critic, William Hazlitt.
Hazlitt uses all this madness to ask a really massive question. How do we actually recognize the mark of true genius versus the work of a total hack?
Which is such a good question. But to get to that question of genius, I think we first have to understand the crucible that forged these main characters.
We have to look at the city of Thebes.
Right. And in the context of the story, Thebes is not some, shining beacon on a hill.
No, it is a poisoned well. It is ruled by Creon, who is this tyrannical, entirely boundless king.
Just the worst kind of leader.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And operating right under him, high up in the hierarchy, are our two protagonists, the cousins, Palamon and Arcite.
They're young, elite warriors, right? Nephews of the king.
Yeah, and they absolutely despise everything the man stands for.
It's the ultimate toxic workplace. I love Act 1, Scene 2, because they're basically having the ancient equivalent of a whispered conversation by the water cooler.
Just complaining about the CEO.
Exactly. Arcite is looking around at the state of the city, and he's like, we have to get out of here. If we stay, it's going to, quote, sully our gloss of youth.
That phrase is so good.
It really is. And he has this incredibly sharp line where he notes that in Thebes, every evil hath a good color.
Let's actually unpack the mechanics of that phrase for a second. Every evil have a good color. Because that is a masterclass in understanding systemic corruption.
Right, because corruption rarely looks like a cartoon villain.
Exactly. Systemic corruption survives by rebranding itself. The evil is given a good color. It's dressed up as economic pragmatism or corporate synergy or national security.
Oh, that's such a good point. And Palamon and Arcite are totally awake to this. Palamon observes that Creon only attributes the faculties of other instruments to his own nerves and act.
Which, in modern terms, means the CEO takes credit for the labor of everyone below him.
Yes. He treats people as completely disposable instruments, and he feels zero remorse about the collateral damage.
So they see the toxicity with perfect clarity. They have this moment where they agree to just walk away before the culture infects their own character.
But then the inciting incident just crashes into their plan.
Right. Theseus, the Duke of Athens, declares war on Thebes.
And the reason for this war is so crucial, because Creon is such a monster that he refused to allow the burial of the kings he defeated in a previous battle.
He literally left them to rot in the sun, which is a massive violation of ancient world ethics.
Right, so these three grieving queens beg Theseus for military intervention. So Theseus is essentially coming as an agent of justice to stop a tyrant.
Yes. So faced with this, What do our ethically aware, highly critical cousins do?
Well, they do the exact opposite of what their moral compass was just telling them to do.
They immediately abandon their plan to flee.
It's so frustrating. They decide they must stay, take up arms, and fight to defend the very tyrant they were just tearing apart in private.
It is a massive rationalization.
This is where their logic just completely falls apart for me. Like, are they actually being noble here? Because Palamon argues that to remain neutral is a dishonor, and to oppose their uncle is rebellious.
He says, we must with him stand to the mercy of our fate.
But to me, that just sounds exactly like what happens in a deeply unethical modern corporation. You know the company is corrupt. You literally sit at happy hour on Friday saying, this place is destroying my soul. I am quitting on Monday.
We've all been there or know someone who has.
Right. But then a rival company launches a hostile takeover or a massive PR crisis hits the brand. And suddenly, you justify staying.
You tell yourself it's about loyalty to the team.
Exactly. Loyalty to the team, protecting the brand, or honestly, you just fear stepping out of the hierarchy when things get chaotic.
What you are pinpointing there is the profound psychology of complicity. If we look at how the brain actually processes this kind of cognitive dissonance, it's fascinating.
Walk us through that. What's happening in their heads?
Well, Palamon and Arcite are high-status individuals in a corrupt system. Their identities, their wealth, their social standing, it's all inextricably linked to Thebes.
So they have a lot to lose.
Everything. So when an external threat appears, like Theseus, it triggers this primal tribal defense mechanism. And that mechanism completely overrides their higher-level moral reasoning.
The brain just seeks safety in the familiar hierarchy.
Exactly. But to protect their self-image as, good men, they have to compartmentalize. Notice how Palamon uses the language of duty to mask his fear of independence.
Oh, yeah. He explicitly states, our services stand now for Thebes, not Creon.
Right, which is the classic separation maneuver.
Like saying, I'm not working to enrich the terrible CEO, I'm just working to support my colleagues in the marketing department.
Precisely. It's an attempt to mentally separate your daily labor from the ultimate beneficiary of that labor.
But the text reveals that this is a totally false separation, right?
It is. By fighting for Thebes, their swords are literally keeping Creon on the throne. This is the very definition of moral injury in a compromised environment.
You cannot cleanly divorce your output from the goals of the institution you serve.
You really can't. And Arcite actually articulates the exhaustion of this reality perfectly. He says, not to swim in the aid of the current, we're almost to sink, and to follow the common stream, it would bring us to an eddy where we should turn or drown.
Wow. When you are immersed in a poisoned river, constantly swimming against the current takes a massive psychological toll.
It is exhausting.
Yeah.
So eventually you just float. And by floating, you become part of the toxic current itself.
And if you are listening to this right now, I think this is a huge moment to look at your own professional or social ecosystem.
A moment for reflection, for sure.
Yeah, because where do you draw the line between loyalty to your group, your company, your political faction, your extended family, and your own internal moral compass?
It's a very uncomfortable question.
I really want you to think about one specific area in your life right now where you might be tolerating an unbounded tyrant just to keep swimming with the common stream.
Where are you telling yourself I'm just doing it for the team to avoid that terrifying leap of actually walking away from a bad situation?
It requires a brutal level of self-honesty to recognize when our sense of duty has just become a comfortable excuse for complicity.
And, spoiler alert, the play does not reward their complicity.
Not at all. They fight bravely, but they are utterly defeated.
They're captured by Theseus, stripped of their armor, their titles, their freedom, and thrown into a high-security prison in Athens.
Which drops us into what is arguably the most dramatic and, frankly, kind of absurd pivot in the entire text.
Act 2, Scene 2.
Right. They are facing life behind bars. They have literally nothing left but each other. And at first, they handle this absolute catastrophe with this soaring, beautiful, stoic philosophy.
The poetry they exchange in the cell is genuinely magnificent. Arcite looks around their bleak reality and says, let's make worthy use of this place.
He reframes the prison as a holy sanctuary to keep us from corruption of worse men.
Right. He builds this entire philosophical argument that being locked up is actually a blessing, because it saves them from the vanity, the political backstabbing, and the dangers of the world they just left.
And Palamon just echoes this perfectly. He says they don't need the world because they have each other. He delivers this really famous line, "We are an endless mine to one another. This place is our inheritance."
They vow to spend the rest of their lives in perfect, unbroken philosophical brotherhood.
And it sounds so incredibly elevated. But reading this, I can't help but compare their grand prison vows to, like, making a New Year's resolution to stop eating junk food when you've just finished a massive Thanksgiving dinner.
That is a perfect analogy.
It is so easy to commit to fasting when you are physically incapable of eating another bite.
Right. It's easy for them to say, I renounce the material world and the love of women, when they are locked in a stone box with literally zero access to either of those things.
It is an entirely untested philosophy.
Untested is the exact word. Their stoicism is entirely situational.
And then the test arrives.
It doesn't take long.
Nope. Down in the garden outside their window, Amelia, the sister of Hippolyta, is gathering flowers.
Palamon looks out the window first.
And he is instantly thunderstruck. He calls her a goddess. He claims her as his own.
And a moment later, Arcite looks out, sees her, and says, she is wondrous fair.
And the tension just spikes immediately. Palamon gets so defensive.
Palamon says, yes, but you must not love her.
And Arcite, completely abandoning the brotherhood they established literally 3 minutes prior, responds, I will not, as you do, to worship her as she is heavenly. I love her as a woman.
And with that single distinction, the entire illusion of their bond shatters into a million pieces.
The whiplash is almost comedic if it wasn't so violent. Instantly, this lifelong, unbreakable, endless mind to one another bond morphs into venomous hatred.
Palamon calls Arcite a traitor, false to his blood.
And Arcite essentially says, I love her, I have a right to love her, and if you don't like it, prepare to die.
They immediately start threatening to murder each other over a woman who is just picking flowers and doesn't even know they exist.
So we have to ask the big question here. Was their friendship ever actually real, or was it just a trauma bond built on shared misery?
That is the core of it. What we are witnessing is the total collapse of a manufactured identity when confronted with a primal biological imperative.
Can you break that down? How does the biology hijack the philosophy here?
Well, if we look at this through the lens of evolutionary psychology and resource scarcity, the mechanics of their betrayal make perfect, terrifying sense.
Okay, go on.
In the prison, they were equally deprived. When you and your ally are both starving, you can share a deep defensive solidarity. Your brains are functioning in a state of mutual survival.
Right, you need each other.
But the moment the highly desired, entirely scarce resource is introduced, in this case Amelia as a potential mate, that primal drive completely bypasses the higher rational brain functions where their philosophical vows were stored.
So the cognitive load shifts entirely from how do we survive this cell together to I must possess this scarce resource to ensure my own biological continuation.
It overrides everything. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self is deeply applicable here.
I love Jungian psychology. How does the shadow play into this?
The shadow contains the repressed, primal, competitive parts of our nature that we refuse to acknowledge, mainly because they conflict with our idealized self-image.
And they had a very idealized self-image in that cell.
Exactly. Palamon and Arcite repressed their competitive drives under a very thin veneer of noble brotherhood. They didn't actually master their desires, they just lacked the opportunity to express them.
Oh, that's such an important distinction. Lacking opportunity isn't the same as mastering desire.
Right. So when the shadow was triggered by Amelia, it didn't just emerge politely. It exploded and completely hijacked their conscious minds. The real tragedy is their absolute lack of self-awareness. They believe their own PR.
Which is a massive danger for anyone. I mean, we often think we are so enlightened, so calm, so perfectly above the petty squabbles of the office or our social circles.
But really, we just haven't been presented with the specific temptation that would break us.
And that leads to a very challenging diagnostic question for anyone listening today. I call it the Amelia test.
I like that. What is the test?
Look at your own closest alliances right now. Your business partner, your co-founder, your most trusted confidant. What is the one thing that could instantly shatter that partnership?
Is it a specific amount of money? A specific promotion?
Public recognition. We all have an Amelia. We all have a trigger that could bypass our higher reasoning.
Acknowledging your vulnerabilities and accepting that you are still driven by underlying primal instincts is what actually prevents sudden betrayals.
Because if you pretend you are just an endless mine of perfect, unshakable loyalty, you are completely defenseless when the flower gatherer shows up in the garden.
It is a profoundly sobering reflection on the fragility of human agreements.
It really is.
But as we move forward, the narrative actually provides us with a very dark, deeply unsettling mirror to this exact madness.
Yes, the subplot.
Right. Palamon and Arcite represent a sort of highborn, aristocratic, obsession. Even as they threaten to murder each other, they speak in grand poetry, they call upon the gods, and they frame their violence through these rigid rules of chivalry.
It's very dressed up.
But the play brilliantly undercuts this by showing us the exact same psychological fracture in a lower-class character, stripped of all that poetic armor. The jailer's daughter.
This subplot is harrowing. It is so tough to read.
It is brutal.
The jailer's daughter falls completely obsessively in love with Palamon while he's in the prison, and it is entirely unrequited. He barely notices her.
But her obsession drives her to steal the keys and free him.
Yeah, and then she flees into the woods trying to find him, but he's gone. She is left all alone. She's starving. She is terrified of the wild animals, and the sheer weight of the grief, the isolation, and the fear completely shatters her mind.
Her descent into madness is portrayed with such brutal realism. Unlike the cousins who use chivalry to rationalize their madness, she has no ideological framework to protect her. Her mind just fragments entirely.
We see her begin to hallucinate vividly. She talks about ships sinking in the night. She sings disjointed ballads.
And she has this terrifying vision of being in hell, where she describes seeing a cauldron of lead and usurer's grease.
Okay, let's stop on that specific hallucination for a second. Usurer's grease. Because a usurer is someone who lends money at predatory interest rates. Why is her shattered mind conjuring images of financial exploitation and grease in hell?
It's a really brilliant textual detail. It symbolizes consumption and corruption. Usury was considered a deeply immoral consumption of other people's livelihoods.
So it's predatory.
Exactly. Her mind is projecting a world that is fundamentally predatory, a world that consumes the innocent. It reflects her own feeling of being consumed by a system and an obsession that has offered her zero return.
Wow. It's a profound depiction of how untreated psychological trauma doesn't just make you sad, it literally reconstructs your sensory reality to match your internal terror.
And how the people around her try to handle this reconstructed reality is, well, it's deeply uncomfortable for a modern reader.
That is an understatement. Her father and her friends eventually find her wandering in the woods, and they bring in a doctor to cure her thick and profound melancholy. And this doctor's prescription.
It is a massive obstacle to growth for anyone reading this today, because it is so incredibly invasive.
It really is heavily countercultural and, by our standards today, ethically monstrous.
To understand it without endorsing it, we have to look at the Renaissance medical context. The doctor's prescribed cure is based on archaic, highly misogynistic theories of female physiology.
Often tied to humorism, right? And the concept of the wandering womb.
Yes. The medical belief of the time posited that intense psychological distress in women was actually a physical ailment of the reproductive system, a buildup of toxic humors that could only be cured by marriage and sexual consummation.
So the idea was literally that a woman's reproductive organs could wander around her body and cause mental illness if she wasn't having sex.
As bizarre as it sounds to us, yes. So the doctor looks at the jailer's daughter, who is suffering from a profound psychological break, and prescribes a physical, non-consensual trick.
He tells her, wooer, who is a local man who has been trying to marry her, to pretend to be Palamon. The doctor explicitly instructs him to sing to her, eat with her, and then sleep with her in the dark so she doesn't realize who it is.
The exact quote is, "Please her appetite and do at home, it cures her."
It's essentially prescribing sexual assault as a medical intervention.
We must firmly, unequivocally reject the ancient practice of deception and non-consent here. It is horrifying.
Absolutely.
However, the exercise of discernment requires us to ask, beneath this terrible, unethical method, is there an enduring observation about human nature that the text actually gets right?
I think there is, and it points to something we still struggle with today, frankly. To me, it highlights our relentless desire to cure deep psychological trauma with superficial behavioral fixes, or by just gaslighting the person in pain.
Expand on that. How do you see that operating today?
Well, the jailer's daughter is suffering from profound isolation and a shattered sense of self, right? And the doctor's solution is, let's trick her into thinking she got the external thing she wanted. Let's put a behavioral Band-Aid on a psychological bullet wound.
We definitely still do this.
We do, not with forced marriages, obviously. But think about how often society tells someone suffering from deep systemic burnout to just try a new productivity app or go on a weekend retreat.
Or do some yoga.
Right. Or worse, we gaslight people suffering in toxic environments by telling them, it's not that bad, you just need a better mindset. We constantly try to alter their external behavior or trick their perception without ever actually addressing the root cause of the psychological pain.
That is a phenomenal mapping of the underlying dynamic. We prefer the quick physical intervention because dealing with the shattered psyche is just too difficult.
It takes too much time and empathy.
Exactly. But what is also fascinating here is that despite the deeply flawed method, the text recognizes a fundamental truth that modern medicine has really only fully re-embraced in recent decades: the intrinsic, undeniable link between the mind and the body.
The somatic experience of trauma?
Yes. The doctor observes her physical deterioration and notes that intemperate surfeit of her eye has distempered the other senses. He recognizes that an emotional trauma, her obsessive love and subsequent grief, has manifested as a total physiological breakdown.
She stops eating, she cannot sleep, her nervous system is completely hijacked.
The play, even carrying all its archaic baggage, understands you cannot separate mental health from physical reality. Her perturbed mind requires intervention because it is actively destroying her body.
It's a stark reminder that when the mind breaks under pressure, whether you are a noble knight rationalizing murder or a jailer's daughter wandering in the woods, the consequences are physical, they are real, and they are devastating.
And this striking juxtaposition within the text, the high philosophical, soaring poetry of the cousins mixed with the base, raw, deeply disturbing prose of the jailer's daughter, it brings us to a fascinating meta question.
Which is what?
When you look at a work of art or any complex system that contains such incredible heights of insight right alongside such jarring, uncomfortable, or clumsy elements, how do you judge the mind that created it?
Which brings us to the debate surrounding the authorship of this play and our provided source material from the great essayist William Hazlitt.
Yes, let's bring Hazlitt in.
Because for centuries, critics have argued over what Shakespeare actually wrote. The text of the Two Noble Kinsmen is widely accepted today as a collaboration between Shakespeare and John Fletcher. But Hazlitt's commentary uses this era of theater to dive into a broader debate about how we identify the master's hand in art.
Hazlitt is specifically responding to a German critic named August Wilhelm Schlegel.
Right.
Schlegel is analyzing Shakespeare's doubtful plays. Works like Titus Andronicus, Pericles, and the Yorkshire Tragedy. These are plays that are wildly uneven. Some of them are intensely violent, some are grammatically disjointed, and they just don't seem to fit the polished mold of Hamlet or Macbeth.
So what is Schlegel's take on them?
Schlegel makes an argument that sounds incredibly logical to our modern ears. He relies on the idea of an apprenticeship.
Like the 10,000-hour rule.
Exactly. Schlegel argues that no genius just wakes up and writes a masterpiece. They have to figure out their craft. So he concludes that these flawed, rough, early plays must just be Shakespeare finding his footing.
That makes total sense.
He argues that the excessive, clunky accumulation of cruelties in a play like Titus Andronicus is just a young writer experimenting with shock value before he discovered the richest veins of a noble metal.
I mean, logically, you have to make a few bad, lopsided clay pots before you throw a perfect vase. But Hazlitt reads this very reasonable argument and absolutely destroys it.
He completely rejects Schlegel's premise that a genius starts out by being a hack.
Hazlitt argues that true mastery is recognized by its fundamental approach, not just its timeline of polish.
Yes, he looks at the violence in Titus Andronicus and says, no, this isn't just an immature Shakespeare. This is a fundamentally different kind of mind at work.
Because it's too mechanical, right?
Right. He points out that Titus relies on a, quote, systematic preference of violent effect. It uses an accumulation of vulgar physical horrors to shock the audience.
And Hazlitt's profound point is that even an immature, untrained genius wouldn't rely on cheap systemic violence to generate emotion, because a genius instinctively understands that the true power of art lies in psychological movement, not just physical gore.
He's saying the actual DNA of the work is wrong. The mechanics are flawed.
It's like spotting a fake designer watch or recognizing an AI-generated essay versus a human one.
Oh, let's follow that analogy.
Yeah.
How does Hazlitt's method apply to spotting the fake watch?
Well, if you hand a master horologist a fake Rolex, they don't just look at how shiny the casing is. A good fake is very shiny. They look at the sweep of the second hand. They open the back and listen to the frequency of the ticking. The mechanics inside are fundamentally different. A cheap watch ticks loudly and mechanically, which is like that systematic preference for violent effect that Hazlitt talks about. It's blunt force.
But a true Rolex has a smooth, almost imperceptible sweep.
Yes, the gears are built on a different logic entirely. Or think about an AI essay. An AI can write a grammatically perfect essay. It has all the right facts. It is highly polished.
But it often lacks a certain structural heartbeat.
Exactly. It lacks the genuine, unexpected, associative leaps that a human mind makes. The tells of true quality aren't about polish or perfect grammar. They are about the underlying integrity of the thought process.
That maps perfectly onto Hazlitt's literary analysis. He argues that in Titus Andronicus, not only is the grammatical construction constantly false in a rigid mechanical way, but the passion is different.
He says it's the passion of a sanguine temperament rather than a lofty imagination, right?
Yes, it's just brute force emotion. However, Hazlitt also demonstrates how to look for the smooth sweep of the second hand. When he analyzes the play Pericles, he admits the overall story is a complicated, messy absurdity.
But he finds one specific line.
Right, where the character Marina compares the world to a lasting storm, hurrying her from her friends. And Hazlitt says, there. That specific movement of thought, that specific resonance of passion, that is the master's hand. Even in a messy play, the DNA of genius reveals itself in the underlying approach to human suffering.
But wait, I have to challenge Hazlitt here, because it really feels like he is suffering from massive confirmation bias.
That's so.
Well, he clearly idolizes Shakespeare. So when a play is bad, he says, well, Shakespeare obviously didn't write it, the mechanics are wrong. But when there's one single good line in a bad play, he says, Shakespeare must have stepped in to write that one line.
You're not wrong.
Isn't he just reverse engineering his analysis to protect his hero from ever being associated with bad art?
That is a very robust critique, and you are not alone in making it. Hazlitt is certainly engaged in protecting the brand of Shakespeare as this flawless deity of literature.
It's a little convenient.
It is. But if we separate Hazlitt's specific conclusions about Shakespeare from his methodology, the utility of his argument remains incredibly strong. He is teaching us not to be blinded by the label on the package.
Yes, and that is a crucial skill for anyone navigating the modern world. How do you consume information today? We are drowning in an ocean of content.
Much of it is branded with highly reputable names. Legacy news outlets, best-selling authors, massive influencers, verified accounts.
So I want you to cultivate your own internal Hazlitt. I want you to develop a critical eye that looks past the label or the brand name. Evaluate the quality, the integrity, and the approach of the work itself.
Ask yourself, does this article or video rely on a systematic preference of violent effect?
Exactly. Is it relying on clickbait, outrage, fear-mongering, or cheap emotional manipulation to keep my attention? If it does, even if it has a prestigious logo at the top of the screen, it lacks true quality. The mechanics are cheap.
You have to learn to listen for the authentic sweep of the second hand in the information you consume. It is about trusting your own capacity to recognize truth rather than constantly outsourcing your judgment to external authorities or brand names.
I love that. And this theme of recognizing what is truly valuable, even when everything is stripped away, that brings us right back to the climax of the play.
We return to Athens for the ultimate test of honor and fate.
Act 5. The conflict between Palamon and Arcite has reached an absolute boiling point. It cannot be contained by philosophy or prison walls anymore.
So Theseus decrees a tournament.
It is a literal sanctioned fight to the death. Whoever wins the tournament gets Amelia's hand in marriage. Whoever loses gets his head chopped off by the executioner.
The stakes could not be higher. And right before the battle begins, they both go to the temples to pray for victory.
The contrast in their prayers is incredibly revealing regarding their internal mechanics.
Arcite goes to the altar of Mars, the god of war. He prays for physical dominance. He asks for the fierce speed, the strength, and the tactical brutality to win the physical combat.
His focus is entirely on controlling the outcome through force.
Yes. Palamon, however, goes to the altar of Venus, the goddess of love. He doesn't pray for strength in battle. He prays for a sign of her pleasure, arguing that his devotion to love is the truest.
He is focused on the purity of his intention, rather than the physical mechanics of the fight.
And the chaos that ensues after the battle is wild.
Against what you might expect in a typical fairy tale, the guy who prayed to the goddess of love actually loses the physical fight.
Palamon is defeated. Arcite wins the tournament.
So according to the decree, Palamon is brought forward in shackles. The executioner is standing there. The block is ready. He is about to be beheaded.
This is the moment where almost any character would weep, beg for mercy, curse Theseus, or just rage against the unfairness of the gods.
But Palamon delivers this astonishing final speech instead.
He does. Instead of raging against his fate, he finds a profound, almost unsettling comfort in it. He tells his knights not to grieve for him. He says, "We expire, and not without men's pity."
And then he delivers this incredible rationalization. He says, "We prevent the loathsome misery of age, beguile the gout and rheum that in lag hours attend for gray approachers. We come towards the gods young and unwhoppered."
Unwhoppered meaning unfatigued, undecrepit.
He is literally standing in front of the executioner saying, "Hey guys, look on the bright side. At least if my head gets chopped off today, I won't have to deal with arthritis or the gout when I'm 70.
It's wild. He is rationalizing that dying young and honorable is actually a gift from the gods because he gets to skip the physical decay, the joint pain, and the indignity of old age.
What we're looking at here is a perfect, striking distillation of the stoic concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate.
Let's look at the mechanics of what Palamon is doing mentally. He's not just passively accepting his death. He is actively leaning into his defeat.
He is excavating the hidden blessing in his immediate doom rather than raging against an unchangeable reality.
Right. He looks at his impending execution and actively frames it as a preventative measure against a different, perhaps more prolonged kind of suffering.
Okay, but this is where I really struggle with this philosophy. Is this profound ancient wisdom, or is Palamon just coping?
That is the big question.
I mean, really desperately coping, because it feels a little bit like the fox in Aesop's fables who can't reach the grapes and says, well, those grapes were probably sour anyway. Is it actually healthy to tell yourself, well, at least I won't get the gout when a man is sharpening an axe to end your life?
That is the razor's edge of Stoicism. Where is the line between profound, enlightened acceptance and psychological denial? But you have to consider the context of agency.
Jinxer.
In a situation where you have agency, where you can fight back or change the outcome, then yes, this kind of rationalization might just be a cowardly cope. But Palamon has absolutely zero agency left.
The battle is lost, the decree is final, the axe is literally falling.
If the physical outcome is completely unchangeable, your only remaining freedom is how you interpret that outcome.
Reclaiming narrative control.
Precisely. By reframing his death, not as a punishment, but as an escape from future suffering, Palamon chooses an interpretation that allows him to maintain his dignity, to comfort his grieving friends, and to face the block with a clear spirit.
He transforms himself mentally from a victim of chance into a willing participant in fate. He alters his internal reality when his external reality is doomed.
That ability to reframe the narrative is a superpower.
And it's incredibly practical for us today. I call this the early exit reframing. Now, hopefully you aren't facing a literal executioner today, but if you live long enough, you'll experience massive, unavoidable defeats.
Everyone does.
You will lose a job you loved and relied on, a long-term relationship will end against your will, a business venture you poured your soul into will go bankrupt. When that happens and the door is slammed shut and locked, how do you reframe the loss?
How do you mean?
Well, not as a cosmic punishment, but perhaps as a preventative measure against a different kind of misery. Maybe getting fired from that job, as painful as it is today, actually saved you from a decade of soul-crushing burnout in a toxic environment that was slowly destroying your health.
Or maybe that relationship ending abruptly prevented a much deeper, more complicated betrayal 5 years down the line.
Exactly. It is not about pretending that the immediate loss doesn't hurt. It hurts terribly, but it's about finding the hidden grace in the closed door. It's about taking the pen back and writing the next chapter from a place of agency rather than victimhood.
It is about narrative resilience. And this act of narrative vulnerability, of putting your story out there and accepting whatever fate brings, is exactly what the play leaves us with in its final moments.
Yes, the epilogue. The play is over. The actor steps forward, drops character, speaks directly to the audience, and he admits something deeply relatable and kind of shocking.
What does he say?
He says he is cruel, fearful of the audience's judgment. He hopes the play will at least keep a little dull time from them. And he admits that if the first sound they hear from the crowd is a hiss, it will shake the bones of the authors.
After all these grand, sweeping themes of war, chivalric honor, madness, and stoic acceptance of death, the entire text ends on a note of raw, naked human insecurity.
The fear of the hiss.
It is a profound reminder of the vulnerability required to create, to share, or to act in the world.
It grounds everything we've talked about. Because whether you are an apprentice writer trying to find your voice, a master of the form like Shakespeare shaping the English language, or just a person going to work, making choices in a complex world and trying to navigate your relationships without losing your moral compass, the fear of judgment is universal.
The fear of the hiss never really goes away.
It doesn't. But the courage to step onto the stage and act anyway, to make the art, to love the person, to face the defeat with dignity, that is what actually endures.
That courage to act, combined with the discernment to see the world clearly, is the true wisdom we carry forward from this murky, brilliant text.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.